Welcome, everyone. This is Imagine All the People podcast, where we learn to appreciate our experiences and cherish the bond we have as human beings. I am your host, Daniel, and today I had the opportunity to talk to Scott, a Japanese American born in post-World War II era.
I was born and raised in Hawaii, born shortly after World War II, when there was a lot of paranoia because being Japanese American, the fear was that if Japan won the war, we would be discriminated against, and if America won, the same might happen because there were, if you recall history, President Roosevelt at the time declared a executive order that sent thousands of Japanese Americans to internment camps, especially those that lived along the west coast of the United States. But fast forwarding, I've had, depending on how you count, 7 or 8 career changes, which included working as a television reporter, morning news anchor, and the like, and several other industries. So it's been a very interesting ride.
Wow, that's awesome. I just want to talk a little bit more about growing up in post-World War II era, especially being a Japanese American. How do you think that shaped your identity into who you are today?
Well, when the war started, of course, I was an infant. But as I grew up, what I discovered was that a lot of the customary traditions, pounding rice to make a gelatinous substance called mochi, had been suspended. Um, a lot of other customary things had been also suspended for fear of drawing attention to the fact that we were Japanese Americans. And tragically, after the war ended, many of those customs were not resumed. And one of the things I did in a later life when I was producing documentaries and the like was to build a story around the pounding of this rice called Pounding Mochi Sticking Together. And it was a story about a family that fit the same description that stopped pounding the rice when the war started and discovered that years later, after the war ended, that um, when they resumed pounding the rice, it brought the family closer together. And the reason for that is that it depends a lot on, on trust because you have one person holding a rather heavy, long wooden mallet that has a head about 5 inches in diameter. And the handle to that is about 5 feet long, and swinging that down into a rock-shaped bowl where the other person is turning this steaming rice between each pounding of the rice. And so that requires not only coordination but also trust in the other individual. And so that documentary aired on public television in Hawaii, and like you say, followed the story of that family that found that pounding the rice brought them back together again after the war.
Wow, tell me more about that. Can you walk me through the impact that you intended your documentary to take? And can you sort of give a bit more background information on that documentary? I find it so interesting that, these Japanese Americans can be pounding mochi and sort of reconciling with being Japanese American inside the post World War II era.
Well, um, when I left television news, I started my own business. And one of the first things I did was to start these documentaries. And it was top of mind to me that a lot of those traditions had been stopped because I had been giving a lot of talks each May during Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, particularly about Executive Order 9066, which Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed. And that's the one I referred to earlier that sent thousands of Japanese Americans to internment camps and which also confiscated a lot of homes and businesses that were owned and caused basically a lot of grief and a lot of damage. And the documentary was put together with the thought that and the knowledge that not only had customs like this been stopped, but Japanese language schools had also been suspended. Teaching of Japanese martial arts had also been suspended for the longest time as well too. And when I started thinking about that, I thought one of the ways to do this was to focus around the pounding of rice, which was a lot more visual, I guess, in some ways, and probably more emotionally significant, and use that as the focus of how the family came back close again.
Yeah, I can totally imagine that. That's incredible. Now, going back to sort of your childhood, can you walk me through what growing up was like in Hawaii?
It was interesting. My dad was the oldest of three kids, and he quit school in the eighth grade during the Depression in 1928 to help support the family. And fortunately, he was probably the brightest of the three kids. He started in construction as a carpenter and then went to work for a large roofing and flooring company that did business not only in Hawaii, but also Asia and the South Pacific after the war, of course, and became quite successful to the point where he became a vice president in the company. And they sent him with his eighth grade education to Wharton School of Business several times to take advanced courses there. He wanted me and my kid sister to not have to struggle financially when we got old like he did, and sent us to private schools from when we were in kindergarten with the expectation that we would become professionals, doctor, lawyer, that kind of a situation. But so one time on one of his trips back home after traveling on business, he came home in my senior year of high school and asked me, where are you going to college and what are you going to major in? And I told him I was going to major in music, in voice. Um, that obviously didn't go over very well. And he got very upset and he said that you'll never make a living in music, especially singing opera, which is all they taught you in those days. And but I had this passion because I had been singing in high school and entertaining and the like. And we had a huge falling out. Um, and while he could have afforded to send me to college, and I had been accepted at a major music school on the East Coast, we had a huge falling out, and I moved out and worked my way through college, working full time and carrying a full load. Majored in music, and he was right. There was no way I could afford um, a career in singing opera as a Japanese American in those days. But I did, I followed my heart and I did what I felt I needed to do, where my passion was at. And fortunately, we got back together again um, and got very, very close to the point where years later, when I wrote a book on karaoke, and I was teaching a non credit course at the University of Hawaii, he would fashion a small suitcase and pad it so that I could put equipment in there and take it on two national book tours as my wife and I were promoting the book, and so that was really cool.
Hmm. Now, looking back then, what do you think your views on success were? And how did they differ from your father's views of success?
Well, in his generation, success was being financially comfortable. In my definition, it was doing what you wanted to do and following your heart and doing that. So we obviously had a very sharp difference of opinion on values and the like. But fortunately, we're able to resolve that, after a while.
Now that you're looking back, do you regret sort of going to college and pursuing a degree that you want to do and then also having the falling out with your dad? And if you had the chance to change it over again, what things would you change?
Um, I felt bad about the falling out, but I don't feel any regret about pursuing what I wanted to do. I've always done that throughout my life, which isn't to say that I always made the right decision, but I don't have any regrets in terms of looking back and saying, what if I had done this? What if I had done that? Because I did. And in that regard, that's what shaped my life decisions and then and also going forward.
Yeah. And so, from what I understand, back then in the post World War II era, there was a whole entire cultural zeitgeist of being discriminatory against Japanese Americans. Was that what you faced in living in Hawaii, or was it something different?
Well, the good news is being born and raised in Hawaii at a time when the Japanese American population was nearly 40% when I was born, made it easier in that regard. Friends and people I know on the mainland US didn't have it quite as easy. George Takei, Zulu on
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek, for example, his family was relocated to an internment camp, which were actually horse stables in San Bruno, California, where they lived for a little while. And I've had other friends that were sent to other internment camps and faced all kinds of discrimination. Ironically, um, when the war broke out, um, there were a number of Japanese Americans who were in the military in Hawaii and who volunteered or offered to uh, go fight on the battlefront. They were all suspended for a while, for several months, until it became clear to the administration that they were taking on so many losses in Europe, especially, that the administration put out a call for Japanese American volunteers. They were looking for 10,000, and they got swarmed with more than 50,000 applications. And many of those Japanese Americans who volunteered never came back. In fact, it was a most decorated unit in the Army in World War II, in the U.S. Army. And my uncle was one of those who served, but he was fortunate in the sense that he did return, but many others did not. And that was, quite sad as well, too, knowing that many of their relatives were still in internment camps, and these people put their lives on the line for the country to prove their loyalty to the country.
I can imagine that's very difficult, especially when you're pledging loyalty to a country that wasn't loyal to you in the first place. Now, with the executive order, how did it affect you or anyone in your immediate family? And sort of what lasting impacts did you think the executive order had?
The executive order didn't affect me directly, but after the war, when the executive, not after the war, but after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the executive order was issued, an internment camp, uh, construction on an internment camp was started in the leeward part of Oahu. But when the powers that be realized that the Japanese American population in Hawaii was so huge, almost 40%, and that there were essential workers like my dad, who was a carpenter at the time, um, that they needed them for the defense effort, they stopped construction of the internment camp and allowed people like my dad to work, and like I say, to support the defense efforts. This was contrary to what happened on the mainland U.S., where internment camps were moved inland because of the fear that um, Japanese Americans would signal submarines and other warships with lights and the like. And so they decided that they would move these internment camps inland so that to remove that possibility. The um, One of the few people that stood up, one of the few white Americans that stood up for Japanese Americans was Ralph Carr, then the governor of Colorado. And even though the feds put up an internment camp in Colorado. He vocally opposed the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and it hurt him in terms of his run for Congress because he was running for Congress that year, even though he was still a sitting governor, and got defeated. But there's still a large statue of him in Sakura Square in downtown Denver, recognizing what he did on behalf of Japanese Americans.
Yeah, and I read about him too. I just think it's so courageous how he was able to stand against the status quo even when he worked in politics. Now, let's talk a little bit more about after you went to college and sort of your fledgling career. Can you talk me through it?
Wow. Well, one of the things I did when I was working my way through college was to sell cookware door to door. And while I couldn't do it now, it was a tremendous experience because it gave me the skills and ability to make cold calls and call on people I had never met before and the like. And it's helped me tremendously in the future. Um, and then I worked in a fish market at a local large grocery chain until I graduated. From there, my first one of my first jobs was as an MC singer in a burlesque, believe it or not, um, instead of working in an opera. Um, and I was doing this at a time that I was managing a branch office for a large national consumer finance company. That was my first real career, if you will. Um, from there, I moved on to a local finance company and then relocated to the Bay Area during the hippie era and worked for the precursor of real estate investment trusts, doing feasibility studies and the like on income property that the partnership, which was the largest in California at the time, might invest in. Um, I moved back to Hawaii, um, did some freelance work doing some of the same kinds of feasibility studies, and then started working part time in radio because of my interest in music. I thought that if I, even though I didn't want to be a disc jockey, that if I were to be a newscaster, that it would keep me close enough to the music and the like. And so I, at one point, worked at 4 different radio stations part time, all of whom said or ordered me not to work anywhere else or I would lose my job, even though I was only working part time at each of those stations. So as a result, I used 4 different pseudonyms. Um, and unfortunately, a few times I forgot who I was at what station and what name I was supposed to be using. So I would come off with a wrong name. But fortunately, I never got caught with that. Um, that career went on to work full time at the number one rock and roll station in Hawaii, where I was a newscaster. And then I got recruited by both the NBC and ABC television stations because uh, uh, there was a mandate, a federal mandate at the time for hiring minorities in television. And so I was interviewed by both NBC and ABC, went to work for the NBC station as a reporter, and spent a great deal of time there until Fox took it over and found out um, some of the court challenges I had been involved in. I had been subpoenaed 2 times in order to reveal sources of stories and refused to do so. And so they told management that they had to fire me. So they fired me, and I then started working in the corporate sector for a while. I and started my own business as well too, which is when I started doing the documentaries. Um, in the for-profit sector, after I had been working a bit and doing documentaries, a friend of mine at the local utility said that there was an opening to start a video department. And because I had the experience of producing video I interviewed and got the job and started in that and worked my way up to become in worked my way up into management, where I started handling media relations and community relations, and then moved over to the parent company, which is a Fortune 1000 company, where I also did a lot of consulting, training, community relations, crisis management, and the like. Um, and then that's about the time I was teaching part time at the university and started writing a book, which is how I met my wife. And took early retirement from that job, moved to Colorado so that we could help family there with some medical issues. Stayed there, worked in the nonprofit sector, and which was a tremendous experience. And then after several years in Colorado, moved to Florida to help another family member. And then subsequently moved to Ohio about 5 years ago to help care for my mother-in-law who turned 100 in December. Unfortunately, she passed away this March, not because of COVID-19, but just basically old age. And
Wow, I'm sorry
uh,
to hear that.
yeah, well, thank you. So anyway, that's the Reader's Digest version of the transition without all the different jobs involved.
And now I just want to ask you, what major takeaways did you have from each field that you went to? For example, PR, marketing, and being a news anchor.
um, I guess the main thing was to be myself, to look for ways to collaborate with people, and also look for ways to innovate. And and as a result of that, I was very fortunate in working in the nonprofit sector to win several awards in different areas of philanthropy. Went to the White House 3 years in a row to accept those awards, and have used that experience to also train and coach and counsel people, which I've done through my business as well, mostly nonprofits, but also some for-profit people.
Tell me a little bit more about that nonprofit, because you said you found it very rewarding, and I just want to ask, why do you think you found it rewarding as opposed to your other jobs? Or I'm sorry, why did you find it more rewarding than your other jobs?
Yeah, well, when we moved to California, my wife had been offered a very, very good job at a major hospital in the Denver area. And so I took early retirement and we moved over and I helped care for our daughter while she was at work. And then our daughter got fine. And then when my wife came home one day, she said, isn't it about time you start thinking about work? And I said, what? Why should I? She says, well, you better get back. She said, what do you want to do? And I said, I've always volunteered at nonprofits, but I'd like to work with one whose mission and values I embrace. She happened to know someone on a board that was looking for an executive director and introduced me to him. And I interviewed and got the job. Ironically, today being September 11th, the job was with the Japan America Society of Colorado, which was an extension of the Japan America Society, a national organization. And as the ED for that organization, my wife and I went to San Francisco for the celebration of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, um, which was where the end of the war with Japan was signed. And that year, what what happened was that Japan also recruited about 100 volunteers to pay their own way to the United States on a goodwill mission. And um, so we met in San Francisco, had the big ceremony. Colin Powell participated virtually on that, and then we left with our Japanese partners to the different cities that we were returning to. I had three people from Japan who came to Denver. I took them around, and as I was returning them to the airport to continue their visit, where they would all eventually meet up at the White House to have a big celebration, we were sitting in a restaurant in downtown Denver when on TV there were scenes of a plane crashing into the World Trade Center. Obviously, we were in a state of shock, and then they showed the second plane. Um, here were these people who paid their own way on a goodwill mission, watching this all unfurling on TV in front of them. I quickly called the hotel uh, and made arrangements for them to return there because the airports were all closed off.
Mhm.
And all these people had to return back to Japan because no flights were being flown or anything else, and not fulfill their part of the mission. And it was a very, very sad, very sobering moment, especially given the mission that they were on,
Mhm.
and what they had seen, and everything else. And today being, September 11th, makes it even more, in my mind, significant.
Mhm. Wow. Now, talking about 9/11, how do you think that that event shaped you? And do you think that that event had a lasting impact into the person you are today?
It didn't change my outlook so much, except that I've always advocated for equality and equity, and of course after that, and after the Oklahoma City bombing and other incidents, there had been unprovoked attacks on people that looked Middle Eastern,
Mhm.
without any provocation or anything else, and that was very, very sad. In fact, getting back to the Japanese Americans who volunteered during the war,
Mhm.
they were sent to Camp Shelby in Mississippi for their basic training, and they were all Japanese except for the commanding officer who was white. And when the Japanese American soldiers would go off base, when they were off to a bar or a restaurant or what have you, they'd encounter situations where African Americans were being harassed and ridiculed and everything else, and they stood up for them, uh, and let people know that that wasn't right or anything else. So it was. There were a lot of interesting stories that came back from that as well.
Mhm. When you talk about Japanese American racism, I'm immediately reminded of the Harlem Hellfighters or the 369th Regiment, which is a
Hmm.
African American regiment who fought so courageously in World War One and World War Two for America, which was a country that was so racist against them, and yet they fought so loyally for a institution that was really against them. And so that's what I'm immediately reminded of. And do you personally see any parallels now that you look back between Japanese American racism and African American racism in the US?
I don't feel it except when I go to certain places in the South, and when I worked for the Fortune 1000 company in Hawaii, I did a lot of business travel. Excuse me. And uh, on occasion, when I would go to certain places in the South, I would run into potential dangerous situations that caused me to become aware again, and kind of appreciate what others I've known who have lived through this have gone through. But I never had to live through that, which I feel very fortunate. In the presentations I've made on in May for uh, Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, one of the things I show is a headline in the Los Angeles Times newspaper that had some derogatory words, on the banner in bold print. Um, that, as well as basically being shunned by people in certain areas, are the kind of stories I hear. When I worked, as an aside, when I worked in California, uh, as I said during the hippie era, the company I worked for was a rather weird bunch, but very progressive. And in fact, 10 of the four of the 10 general partners had been card-carrying members of the Revolutionary Communist Party. One was a Senate president pro tem, and one was a national lobbyist for Kaiser.
Mhm.
So it was very diverse, to say the least. In spite of that, they were quite progressive. And I approached them one time and I said, "Hey, I've been hearing reports of discrimination in some apartment buildings. How would you feel if I did a survey and turned the results into housing and urban development?" They said, "Sure, go ahead." So I would send white couples, minority couples, mostly black, to the same apartment building where there was a vacancy sign and the like, with pretty much the same qualifications in terms of income, family size, and the like. And invariably, almost all the uh, white applicants would be accepted, and the minority ones, the majority of them, about 80%, would not be. And so I would turn those reports into HUD. What they did with it, I don't know. But it was one of those things where I felt very strongly that something had to be done, and I was allowed to do that.
Definitely. You know, I think in my mind that just draws strong parallels between de facto and de jure redlining and really discrimination in that systemic case. Now, can you talk me through a little bit about your work as in the media field, and especially being a Japanese American? Do you feel any different from anyone else who works in the media field, and do you feel like sort of an accredited pressure to be able to be better than the other people who aren't Japanese American?
Wow. Well, first off, in my estimation, the news business has changed tremendously over the years. When
Definitely.
I when I first started in the news business, um, and that was reading the news in 1972, um, it most of the media, in fact, pretty much all the media, was locally owned, whether it was newspapers, radio, and the like. And even when television came up, um, they weren't locally owned; they were network owned, but they were given pretty good autonomy at the time. Um, then, when I started in television in '73, the same was true, and I, some of I was a little more colorblind, if you will, because being in Hawaii, even though Japanese Americans were the minority, collectively all the minority groups were the majority in Hawaii. So it wasn't that big a deal. But you also have to remember that this was in the post-Watergate era, and and there was a lot of interest in investigative reporting, which
Mm-hmm.
is what I was charged with doing, and that's the reason I was subpoenaed to go to court on two different occasions. The What I saw occurring, especially after I left television, was that more and more um, conglomerates recognized that there was a built-in credibility with the news media, and that people at that time believed what the media was telling them. So these huge conglomerates would buy up the TV stations, the radio stations, the newspapers, and the like. Um, and Where it used to be disallowed to run a political ad on within a newscast, all of a sudden you started seeing political ads within a particular newscast because of the assumed credibility of the newscast. Where it was disallowed in the past, you'd see uh, newspaper advertisements on the op-ed page of the newspaper. Today, you still see some of these things on, these little sleeves on the front page of the paper that have ads in them as well. Um, Before, when the media was more locally owned, they were, I think, more responsive to community attitudes and feelings. And when these conglomerates started coming in, all of a sudden it was about the bottom line, and it became, um, I don't know, I became very concerned. In fact, I guess one experience that affected me was as a reporter at the TV station. I did a story one time about what was very popular called liquid silver. And these were being marketed at swap meets. Drive-ins at the time would open up during the day and have these swap meets or farmers markets, and they would sell this liquid silver.
Hmm.
The problem is that some of them they were selling fake liquid silver. So I did a story about that, and came in the next day feeling pretty good about the expose. And the general manager called me in his office, and I didn't know what was going on. He says, I saw your story last night. And then I got a call from the owner of the drive-in, who happens to be one of our sponsors. And he said, you got to stop doing that. He
Yeah.
didn't challenge the authenticity or the veracity of the story, but rather the fact that because it was a sponsor, that we shouldn't do a story that would affect his livelihood. Um, and since then, I think in general, media has just accelerated to the point where it's all bottom line, and become quite different than the way it used to be.
Wow, in my mind right now, I'm just drawing like these different circles, right? There's so many parallels between what you said in the past and what's happening today. For example, you mentioned post-Watergate era. I'm immediately reminded of Woodward, who just came out with these stark allegations against President Trump. And then even more,
Mm,
I'm reminded of hydrochloroquine when you mentioned liquid silver, with President Trump purporting it to be
yeah.
the drug and the cure all for COVID 19. And I just think that we see so many parallels and so many similarities between the past, present, and the future. So, with what you know and how many years you worked in the media, how has your experience sort of shaped your perspective into the person you are today?
Well, as you know, with the popularity of social media, everybody in some ways is a journalist. And there's good and there's bad in that. The bad being the fact that anybody can say anything, which is the freedom of expression. But a lot of that is also believed by some people without any kind of validation or what have you. When I worked in the media, there were media councils made up of concerned citizens in many large cities and communities that pursued things and advocated for things like sunshine laws and the like. Um, they've all but disappeared today. You don't have that, and it's just gone. It's just gone a lot more liberal in the sense of being unchecked, with no reputable organization or group holding anyone's feet to the fire, or at least any organization that's unanimously endorsed or supported by the general population. But if anything, it's created a divisiveness right now, which I think is extremely dangerous. And I don't know what the solution is, except to just recognize that it's very, very different. It's very troubling to me because I think of the divisiveness that's been created in the country. And uh, what I am praying very strongly for is someone or some forces that come up and come together to take hold of things that would help to reunite everyone. Not that everyone should feel the same way, think the same way, or act the same way, but rather to get everybody pointed in the same direction. We all, I think, basically want the same things. We want a good, safe, happy life for ourselves, our families, and want to be productive and everything else. But um, after that, the manner in which that's supposed to be achieved, um, and equality and everything else aside, seems to be so different in many
Mhm.
people's minds that we can't, can no longer agree on how we're going to get there. And until and unless we do, I have this very strong fear for future generations in going forward. The only optimism I have is because I've been ghostwriting about brand advocacy, social media, and the like for over a year for a large client in New York, is that the younger generations, especially Generation Z, but even millennials, expect more of this consciousness
Mm.
and are more willing and, in fact, almost insistent on supporting organizations that do are active in supporting equality and equity going forward. But uh, because there's so many others that still don't feel that way, I'm still very concerned about that.
Definitely. I just want to zoom in a bit more. Going back to the way you changed your college career, the way you changed your majors, and the way you were so courageous in forging your own path. And now, when you're looking forward into the world, do you feel optimistic, or do you feel a little bit different, or how are you trying to constantly improve yourself to be the person you want to be?
Definitely trying to improve myself. It's debatable whether I've been successful or not, but in the sense of the falling out with my dad, it was a couple of years, and while that was regrettable, I did what I felt I needed to do, what I had to do, and I think in hindsight he recognized that as well, which is what got us back together again. So um, the biggest epiphany for me was as a reporter when all this stuff started happening, when I was in and out of court and there were rumors of a hit being out on me. The hundreds of people that I thought were friends suddenly disappeared, where I could count the number of friends on one, maybe two hands. And at first it was a huge shock, but in after that wore off and I could see more clearly, I realized that it was actually a blessing to realize who my true friends really were. And even though they were far less than what I thought they were initially.
Scott, now for anyone who's in between the decisions of making a leap of faith, whether it be choosing a college major like you did, or choosing a certain career path that's different from what others tell them to do, what words of advice would you give them to help them along this decision?
I strongly believe that you need to pursue whatever your dream is. Um, and that, because otherwise you'll never be happy. Uh, I know a lot of Japanese Americans my age who did what their parents wanted them to do and didn't pursue their own dreams. And they did okay, but in their hearts, they weren't as happy as they could or should have been because they wanted to uh, follow a different path and go along a different roadway. Um, and so we have to live with those choices that we make, which is the bottom line. And I think that's the main thing that we have to weigh when we're faced with those decisions. Whether we're going to please somebody else or please ourselves, or try to strike a compromise, which sometimes can be very challenging.
Mhm. Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott, for taking the time and talking with me today. I think we all learned so much about your experiences living life as a Japanese American in the post World War II era and all of these hard and incredible decisions you had to make on your part. Thank you so much for sharing with me.
Well, it's my pleasure, Daniel.
Thank you so much for listening to the Imagine All the People podcast. This was Scott, and we hope you will join us in the next episode.